Hey there, it's with great pleasure to speak with the famous George Howell on this episode of Cropster's Coffee and Technology podcast. George is a true pioneer and progressive of the specialty coffee industry that dates back to the 1970s. George has been at the forefront of every major industry shift to better the coffee industry and has revolutionized the way we approach many parts of the industry, especially freezing coffee. Grab your coffee and enjoy the many stories and perspectives that George brings to the table. And be sure to follow or subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform. Welcome back, Norbert. Welcome, George, to the podcast. It's super exciting to have you here. How are you doing today?
Very happy to be here and doing pretty well.
Awesome.
And love to talk about interesting topics, and especially when they're on coffee.
Fantastic. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting. I mean, you're I would say a true progressive and pioneer of what specialty coffee is today. And a lot of our listeners will know that and will know who you are, which is a very fortunate thing to, like I said, to have you here. But I mean, you know, as we continue to do these episodes and whatnot, there may be a time when someone may not know who George Howell is. So I would love if you can briefly just give a quick, introduction of, who is George Howell, where he was when he started in specialty coffee and where he is today. It's always interesting, even for people that do know you, to always listen to that story.
Okay. Well, long story. It starts in 1974. That's when, basically before I got into coffee at all, other than as a consumer, I really was involved with art. That's what I studied in college. That was my passion, contemporary art in particular, painting, music, all of that. Pretty much avant-garde, from avant-garde jazz, to painting and sculpture and so on. So I was very affected by my closest friend, who basically was connecting to Mexico with Huichol indigenous artists. A tribal culture that really was completely free of Western influence, extraordinarily so.
Nice.
And they were doing these pieces that were mythological, using yarn, that really had potential and great depth. My friend connected to them as individual artists, not as folk artists. And basically challenge them to do unique pieces only, no repetition whatsoever, and to explore their medium. And so that's what started happening. And stuff started coming to me in California, where I was living, in San Francisco, Berkeley area. And I started exhibiting that in art galleries and such. And it really became my passion. And it also became a passion to give names to those artists, because folk art is all too often presented as something that goes into your children's room, something that is less heavy than by a real artist. And in my mind, these artists needed the recognition that European and American artists got as artists per se, right? So that was the mission. And I moved very much with the intention of exhibiting this in museums and art galleries, not in anthropology museums, right?
Okay.
But real galleries on the East Coast. And that was already hard enough on the West Coast, which was more frontier and more into experimentation. It was almost impossible on the East Coast. We moved there in '74, and I made trips to my past to Yale, where I had been a student, exhibited, showed the art to a very famous professor there, who loved the art. But when I went to museums or galleries, it was often rejected precisely because it was indigenous. I mean, fundamentally, to me, racist. Dismissals. And while I had a few much smaller successes, this was very frustrating. I brought two kids with me and a third on the way when we moved to Boston. And art was not making it for me. we brought with us, when we came from the San Francisco area, I brought lots of coffee with me, the coffee that I loved in whole bean. I brought a grinder. Back in those days, it was a simple blade grinder, and a French press, which I was in love with back in those days. And I'd stop at the Howard Johnson's, which existed then, basically a restaurant that was on the interstate highways.
Okay.
And we'd come in there for breakfast, and I'd bring my French press and my grinder, go to the men's room, grind the coffee, order hot water for tea, right? And instead make myself a French press there.
That's awesome.
By the end of the 20 to 30 minutes of having breakfast with my coffee, literally 2 or 3 people would come from around there saying, "What have you got there? What is that?" I mean, I always ran into that. So it's kind of interesting that before I was in the business, I was in the business.
Right.
Right. So anyway, came back here and, started looking for coffee when I ran out. And you'd see basically cheese shops and specialty shops that were basically selling wooden pellets painted brown that you ground into sawdust. And that's what you drank, right? So I was looking for a way to make money on the one hand, and really desperate to have good coffee because I had really become used to it on the West Coast. And so we decided to get into the business.
That's amazing.
Right? And so that's how that started, right? So instead of going back to college, which is what my intentions were, we stayed in the Boston area and decided to open up a cafe selling good quality coffee. And we knew, my background was, I really love food. I had lived as a teenager in Mexico City, gone to a French school, which is all about the culture of the cafe, Jean-Paul Sartre, philosophers, all these people. So that cultural piece was there. And then I happened to love coffee too, very different from the French roast you got in France back in those days. It's 2 different things, right? So I was sort of, it fit very well with what I wanted to go to do. So we tried to figure out a name. That was easy because those were the days of the French Connection, the movie, right? My wife, Lori, came up with the name, Coffee Connection, and we all went, wow. That was it. Okay, so it became
just
Coffee
clicked.
Connection. And then we thought we could let our fingers, in those days, the expression was, let our fingers do the walking through the yellow pages, something that doesn't exist anymore. And we found a gourmet roaster, because we thought the coffee was so stale. We had no idea about anything else, but we knew the coffee was stale. So we thought we could just find a really great roaster here and we could sell it and, have our cake and eat it too. And this was 1974, and this salesperson comes to our home, literally to our home, with 3 bags of green coffee, Colombian, Central American, and Brazil, and said, "Hey, I can mix them any way you want, and mix them one way, it's Kenya Double A, mix them another way, it's Jamaica Blue Mountain, no problem whatsoever," right? With my jaw dropping. Right. So basically, at that point, we realized we needed to roast our own coffee. Period. And so we started. We had a very close friend on the West Coast who basically did a little bit of detective work there, knocking on the doors of different cafes, asking who is providing the green coffee for roasting, really high quality. And all roads led to Erna Knudsen. Period. So we connected with her, and she was one of the most joyful, amazing people I've ever encountered in all of coffee, right? A woman who had started as the secretary and became the owner of her company, right? True visionary. So she started sending us coffee, and literally from when we opened in 1975 all the way to 1987, 88, I was getting 90% of all my coffee from the West Coast.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And that's how I got involved with specialty coffee. Was we found a place right in Harvard Square in Cambridge, really in the center of Harvard University, and all the activity, and so many people coming from outside of state, and everybody coming into that one zone, a real cultural nodal point, right? And so my intentions were to prove points, right? One, I saw that there was a lot of mislabeling, to put it mildly, and I wanted to correct that. Two, we now had a roasting machine, which, thanks to Erna connecting us to Germany, we had a small Probot UG15 brought in, which we set up. But it wasn't in Harvard Square because the cost to do that and the pollution and everything else, forget it. So we had that outside. So how do I prove I'm roasting the coffee? One. And two, how do I prove that no, all coffees don't taste the same? They taste very different from each other. So the solution to the first one was roast date, right? So 20 years before just about anybody else in the coffee industry was doing it, we did it right off the bat when we opened in April 1975.
Nice.
And we never looked back. And this was on every single, back then we were scooping beans into bags, right? Because there wasn't the one-way valve, none of that. But every barrel had it with the coffee on it. And every bag of coffee, we wrote the roast date on it as well. So people really got that in their minds, right?
So George, you were mentioning the linkage, or that bringing the artist to the forefront. That really stuck with me, and that's really an amazing story. And I got a feeling that's what you also.
And that would be much more important down the road.
Exactly. So was you somehow replicated in coffee to show the artist, to show the true nature and the true origin.
That's exactly right. But I didn't discover that in coffee until the late 80s.
And how did that happen?
Okay, so that was where I was going. But the first thing was that proving the roast date and the roast, and the second one was the French press, which allowed you to brew any coffee on the spot.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So we could prove the point. Here, try these two coffees. Right. So those two things right from the start. Then really we're doing blends on the one side, but also single origin in terms of the country. All right. So maybe it was Guatemala Antigua, but it wasn't a farm.
Right.
It was Kenya AA, but it wasn't anything else.
Yeah.
Right. And I would ask about that, and the answers that I got is, well, that's all there is, right? There was no single farms back then. It was about around 1985 that I first connected to any kind of farm at all from Guatemala Antigua, a very famous farm, but which sent me after a year of buying their coffee, which was very good. The following year, I got bags that had dried cherries in them, rocks in them, and so on. And so it really wasn't serious.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until 1988 that I really went to coffee farms. I had gone to Kona, but only just kind of, not really centered on it. But 1988 was the revolution, right? Up until that point, it really was about the quality that we presented in the way of roasting and the information we gave, but not about the farmer yet. And I met Bill McAlpin for La Minita on the one side from Costa Rica, who was driving through. I mean, basically, he came to Virginia with, I don't know how many bags of La Minita coffee from Costa Rica, called up and said, hey, can I come by and let you taste some? I didn't even know how to cup in 1980.
They were just brewing a French press.
Well, that time we were now doing it in paper filters. Single cone.
Nice.
Right.
Nice.
So sort of like a V60, plastic cone. And we brewed his coffee and ours. And I noticed that there was a slight difference, and then he gave me the price, which was double what we were paying, right? Literally. somewhere around $3.50 a pound
back
in
then.
1988.
Wow.
That's
That's a lot.
price back then.
Yes.
And I swallowed hard and said yes, because I'm the guy, the quality nut per se.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm the guy in 1975 who basically said very clearly that I'd rather go broke selling great coffee than make a fortune selling garbage.
Yeah.
Right? So any slight difference I found made a difference, right? And I picked that. And I later realized that when you cup or taste something and you see a slight improvement in one versus another, that's one sip. What happens when you drink an entire cup of coffee? That slight difference becomes a very big difference, or can be, right? So these are issues that people who are just stuck on cupping and not drinking do not get.
Yep. Interesting.
Right? So in any case, we started getting it, and it really was better, and no doubt about it. And that was very exciting. And he invited me to La Manita, and I went there at the end of 1988 and cupped coffee for the first time, for real, right? Erna had been doing it, but I hadn't really grasped it. There, Bill McAlpin, anybody who knows him, this guy is really confrontational. He just puts you on the spot and enjoys doing it. And not easy to get along with. But in any case, so I was in San Jose, the capital, and we went to the lab that he was going at, I think it was part of Pol Cafe at the time. And there were 5 coffees, Costa Rican high grown. And he said, one of these is my La Manita, and the others are very good Costa Ricans, but not La Manita. Pick the one that's mine, right? And this is blind. Of course, I have no idea which it is. And he says, just look for really clean, right? Clean coffee, sweet. That's what you're looking for. So I've only got those 2 things to go on, and thank God I picked it. That could have been the difference between my continuing on or leaving the business, right?
Do you know your stuff or not, kind of thing?
It's scary. I think my hand was trembling as I brought the spoon to my mouth, right? With him enjoying every second of it.
Of course.
And it was the word clean that really gave it away to some degree, because it wasn't looking for thick chocolate or any of those things. On the contrary, it wasn't the opaqueness. It was the clarity and the translucency. And that's what I picked, right? There was part of me saying, no, pick the one that's stronger and more. But I picked that one just based on the word. And that was the correct choice. So that always stayed with me as a major piece.
What was your customers' response to those new Costa Rican coffees in your coffee shops at that time?
That's interesting. It started as like under 1% of sales, because I had to charge a lot more for it.
Right.
And it grew every single year. So I had somewhere around 35 different offers at the end. Right, and this was over 5% of sales, which is really good.
Huge, yeah.
For a much higher price coffee, So it was becoming the single origin. And the other one that became even more popular and was equally and even more expensive was Kenya. And at the same, literally in the same year, Erna invited me to Kenya. And I went to Kenya as well. And there I met Jeremy Block, who had recently bought Norman's coffee. Right. He did not originate that, right? But he had taken the courses, become a master cupper in Kenya himself, and was, I would say, equally radical to me. Was all about there at that time. You really weren't talking farms; you're talking co-ops, cooperatives, right? And they were doing. I mean, their lots were double to triple the size that they are now. As you probably know, Kenya production has dropped dramatically over the last 2 decades, dramatically, and so have the lot sizes, right? But When I was there, he had me cup, and that's a completely different cupping experience. You're not cupping 6 or 10 coffees; you're cupping 50 of them.
Yeah,
literally in a row,
sip, 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 sip,
almost
sip.
as far as your eye can see. Only 2 cups though per coffee, right? And they have a whole different style where they're at least, and I think this was what Jeremy initiated in his cupping, was a very different cupping method than anywhere else, right? Where he had a scoring of 1 to 5, where 1 was perfection. It was if you put 1 down, you were touching God. So and 5 was disaster, was evil, right? So and then you went 1 prime, prime 2, 2 prime, and so on. 2 was really superb, excellent coffee. I'd say about 90 points, 92 points in today's lingo.
Yeah.
Oh,
right. And 3 was very good commercial, or good commercial, right, and so on, etc. So I learned that method as well. And in fact, when I got back to Boston, I started to use that system. And for the next few years, we cupped Kenya style, or
Dorman
literally
style.
Jeremy Block style,
right,
which was great. And we started getting samples of coffee from him directly. Erna basically turned it over to me and said, "I'll take a small percentage. You can deal directly with Jeremy." I mean, this was
amazing.
How many people would do that for you, right?
Yeah.
Extraordinary. So Jeremy would literally send to me, I don't forget how, FedEx or whatever it was back then, rapidly, and I would get the coffees. This was in years where you could not, all coffees had to go through auction. Every one, not a single coffee could be sold in Kenya without going through the auction and being bid for. So I'd get 10, 12 or more samples of really what he cherry picked as being the very best available. And we would cup those things there. We had, Jabez Burns triple sample roaster that we quickly learned how to use. And we would pick our favorites after cupping through it. So I'd get that on a Friday. The auction was on Tuesday. So I had Friday through Monday to make decisions. And then I would talk to him on the phone. He would say, how high do you want to go? And my answer invariably for the ones I really liked was sky's the limit.
Wow. That's a huge commitment.
Yeah. So we won. We were paying, my recollection is $4 to $5 a pound.
That's amazing.
FOB. Yes. Back in those days. Right. Later, after I had sold Coffee Connection to Starbucks, a close associate, not in my company, but in coffee, and who was very quality oriented, who will remain unnamed, basically used my method and said, "Sky is the limit," and got hit with $10.
Yeah. Times are changing.
Kind of finally grasped the way things were being done.
Right.
But in any case, it worked for me great. Right. And so we were bringing in approximately 10 to 12 lots of 40 to 80 bags each.
Yeah.
We were selling Kenyas like no tomorrow.
So, George, we know that you started at some point some preservation efforts in coffee and putting some of your coffees into the freezer. Did that already start at that time? Do you still have coffees from?
No, it hadn't. No. It hadn't. So you always had the problem, and I remember this very well, especially once I started getting the Kenyans and the Lamanitas and so on. As the year went by, your coffee started to age, no matter what you do.
Of course.
And then there was no Grain Pro back then. There was no vacuum sealed. It was all wide open bags, right? So your coffee aged. And by the time, like a Kenya, which would arrive typically in June, as well as Costa Rican, that coffee by November was starting to age, practically all of it. By February, you were dying from the age. I mean, the flavor really had very little to do with why you bought it in the first place, but you were still selling it.
Right.
And then, in comes sometime late spring, early summer, and now the coffee was, and then we'd get the new crop, which great relief. And we would get phone calls from customers saying, wait a minute, this is like somebody turned on the lights in a dark room or something. What did you do? What happened? They had no clue, right?
Right.
But that's the way it was year after year. And this issue continued throughout the Coffee Connection history. It's that 1988 period with Kenya and La Manita that I became interested in single farms or single co-ops, really, right? And I tried to do that a little bit with other areas with varying success, but nothing great. When I sold Coffee Connection in 94, that's when I became free of a company which was really growing. We had 400 employees by that time.
Huge.
Cafes. And I was slowly ballooning away from actually being able to spend time cupping and exploring this new discovery. So it was to my aesthetic advantage to, and I had 6 kids, let's face it, that's something else, college coming up. So I sold it to Starbucks and it freed me up. And I joined the SCAA. I joined the International Relations Committee, where there was half that committee was represented by countries like Brazil, Kenya, and so on, producing countries, and the other half were different roasters in the U.S., right? So I was on that, and one of the members, Marcelo Vieira from Brazil, invited me to join him in this project that the ICO, together with the International Trade something or other center of the United Nations, and this was the Gourmet Project, which turned into Cup of Excellence.
Oh,
right?
Awesome! Yes,
and that was really 1997 to 1999. When going around and cupping with people and so on, it dawned on me: cupping competition, and then how do you sell it? The Japanese really want it. Diedrich really wants it here. Other people want it. How do I choose? And that's why the auction. It made perfect sense.
Right.
And it was based on my knowledge of Kenya, for instance, and also on the competition, Ely Cafe, who had a competition already with Brazil. And I know this isn't answering your question, but I just have to go through the story.
No, of course, yes, yeah.
You've lived the progression of the entire industry, so it's interesting to listen to.
With a lot of help from people just across the goodwill that I experienced in the industry was extraordinary. But so in any case, so that was 1999, 2000. In 2000, I was also hired by USAID to be a consultant, a quality consultant in Peru. And it had to do with coffee for coca.
Right.
The cocoa, the whole cocaine war and all the rest of it. And I made it very clear I had nothing to do with that, and I disagreed with it. But I would come there as a quality consultant to just talk about the quality of what they were producing. Because a lot of people had committed to that, growing coffee. So I came down there and visited many times, but also started receiving samples. And you'd start receiving samples in June. And one of the things that happened was, at that time, I had my sample roaster, a little single Probot sample roaster. I had it at home. I had this great room, that I had set up for that. In my exploration of coffee. And we started cupping, and we'd get the samples. And they were so-so, really. There was a lot of problems back then with the coffees. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, I'd get more samples. And so I'd want to cup those samples against the ones I had received. But the ones I had received within those 3 weeks, being only a few hundred grams, aged very quickly.
Yeah.
And I couldn't compare that to the previous sample. And that was very frustrating. The person who was working with me at that time, Jill Pellerin, not a coffee person, I had taught her how to sample roast, and she got it and was doing that, suggested that we vacuum seal it.
Oh, yeah.
So I got a little vacuum sealer for $150 or whatever, vacuum sealed it. It was better, but it wasn't perfect. And then she suggested, why don't we freeze it? Okay. We froze it. Bingo. And now we could compare for the first time July versus June, August versus June and July, and so on down the road. And that's the beginning of freezing coffee. Right. It genuinely worked.
That's interesting.
Right. So it remained that way as sampling. Right. And I had a whole collection at that point in my freezer of different coffee samples. And then I opened up George Howell Coffee in 2003. And the first one was really a restaurant that didn't work because it was huge. I'm not really a restaurant guy. I'm a coffee guy. So we dropped that. So I had to get involved with wholesale for a number of years, and finally started up another cafe, first in a small suburb and then in the Godfrey, as you know, about 5 years ago. Right. Finally, we came back and I did the full deal, right? A cafe that was the way I wanted it, where you not only served coffee and made single cups of coffee as well as urns of it and all the espresso drinks and so on, but also a small retail section that was dedicated, right?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Thank you. And what we did really from the start with this George Howell Coffee Company was we started freezing coffee right away. At first, we tried freezing coffee that was just in burlap, as the coffee still was in 2003 and 4, and that did not hold up very well. You have condensation issues and so on. So then I went towards vacuum sealing, right? Which I already started pushing immediately for Cup of Excellence.
Right.
And I had retired from Cup of Excellence in 2002 before I started my own business. So one, Datera coffee from Brazil, Luis Pascual, actually came up with it on his own, right? Sealing the coffee in these somewhere around 30-pound bags, and vacuum sealing it and boxed, right? And he came to me with that. And at the same time, I was approaching Dorman's, Jeremy Block, in Kenya to do the same thing. Yeah. And I have a photograph somewhere which shows all these hidden under some big burlap piece, not burlap, but something. A covering, and then it had on top of it George's coffee, right? This was all back in seals, right? In Kenya.
Do not touch George's special delivery.
Right. And so he started sending me that. So we were getting right off the bat in 2003, 2004, coffee from Kenya and Brazil that was vacuum sealed. And that coffee we were freezing.
Like what you've heard so far? This podcast is brought to you by Cropster, a software solution that connects coffee professionals from origin to roasteries and cafes around the world. Whether you produce, trade, roast, or brew coffee, Cropster products will help your business take that next step.
So would you freeze all of your coffees or some special lots?
We started with those two, and then came right on its heels, a few years later, came Grain Pro. Right. And so I had been insisting wherever I could get it. Most people couldn't do this. They just didn't have the technology. They didn't have the equipment and so on. So only a few coffees were coming in that way. And one of them was La Soledad from Guatemala, right? that family is extraordinary that way, right? And they were
You know,
really. He still does that to this day,
Yeah.
Raul.
Yeah.
So in any case, we made experiments then with Grain Pro, and it froze very well as well. There was not a problem with it. And at that point, we then certainly, I mean, you need a lot of room to do
Yeah.
this.
Would you get commercial freezers?
Yes, that's exactly. Well, we connected to the frozen food industry.
Yeah.
Greater Boston. And so our coffee was going along with the Jolly Green Giant and his green beans and peas and all the rest of it in the freezer, right? And that really worked. And then we would bring in every 2 weeks coffee. Basically, we learned that the coffee could age quite quickly once it was out of the freezer. Some more than others, and I'll get into that a little bit further.
You know, I'm really interested too. Going back to when you mentioned the story of how the smaller grain samples they would age much faster, and for me it's interesting and almost revolutionizing in the sense that when you started freezing coffee, it almost not only helps you keep the quality consistent when you're evaluating, but it also gives you and the producer a more consistent evaluation of their work, which is a very important piece to having a more sustainable and scalable industry, I would say, right?
100%. You can cup a coffee from this year's harvest versus last year's as well. So we can talk about the past in ways that just don't involve only the memory. Right. We're much closer to the wine industry. That way, which is critical to do, right? And wine, right from Cup of Excellence forward, and I developed that cupping form, right, for Cup of Excellence, which was the basis for the SCA to this day, right? That whole thing was a complete copy with oversimplifications to it. But doing that was really critical.
So I'm really curious in terms of recording all this information that you've collected in the past years. On one hand, are we seeing an increase in people interested in this and doing this? And also, how does technology play a role in you being able to effectively collect, analyze this information, and also help others who have an interest in this be able to do these same tactics that you use as well?
Right. I mean, certainly the biggest. I've been very open about freezing. There are a number of roasters to this and a rising number of roasters using freezing. One of them is Passenger in Pennsylvania that I can name. Other ones I know are doing it because I hear it, but they're not saying it really that I can tell. That may be because the fear of what does frozen food mean to people, right? Even though it's been shown, I think, pretty clearly that often the frozen vegetables have more vitamins in them than the stuff you get at your grocery store, which says something, right? There is this sense of cheapening, et cetera, with frozen stuff. So I think there's a prejudice there that, better left unsaid and just sell better quality coffee.
I'm not gonna lie. That's the stigma I have of frozen food.
Exactly. So since my whole point is, as it was with the artists before, back in the 70s, and I'm still a collector of that art to this day, right? Is trying to get other people to do it for the benefit of coffee farmers, because farmers have really not been partners, right, in a real sense, in the money that can come to you in specialty, right? Especially in the 80s and 90s, that was not the case. Cup of Excellence helped in that direction a lot. Right. But freezing also helps because it allows you to keep a single farm available for customers year round. Right. Unlike the other way. Otherwise, how often? I mean, I'm aware of it, and we give seminars in this. We do this for customers a lot. Hasn't been possible with COVID, but where we have people taste the same coffee that's been in a burlap bag for a month, or even a grain pro bag for a year, versus the same coffee that was kept in the freezer.
Yeah.
Both roasted on the same day, etc., presented, and the difference is night and day between the two. And we have people taste that difference to show them, right? But to come to really well-known brands, Light Roast, Third Wave, and all the rest of it, and taste a Guatemalan from the previous year in the springtime, and to taste nothing but age, is really sad.
Yep.
Right? And people can talk all they want about seasonal, but then they make mistakes in order.
That was my next keyword.
Oh my God, this 3-month supply is a 1-year supply.
Yeah.
And they have to sell it, right?
Right.
So where do you think blends come from?
Yeah. No, of course.
I guess it blended out of existence.
Yeah, I guess the seasonal concept only has, as it says in the name, a short lifespan. And I think you're offering a highest quality product year round, which of course has a different meaning to the end consumer.
Dramatically. It then impresses on the consumer, I like this particular coffee.
Yeah.
Right. From this farm, right? It takes some of the spotlight away from the roaster and puts it on the farmer. And the more we can do that, there should be a spotlight on the roaster, because they are the midwives of coffee, right? But it also has to be on the farmer, who's even more important, right? That's the golden goose right there. So you need to.
And one thing this makes me think of is this idea of in certain seasonality, also planning, like, in a technological sense, Cropster has Cropster Roast, and there's a production planning feature, and it helps roasters plan ahead and whatnot. But I'm curious, with freezing coffee, and just in a more general operational sense, how does you having the ability to freeze coffee, knowing that it's going to have quality in a year, help you plan, or help your business plan your green coffee purchasing, not just now but throughout the entire year, and make sure you're having a supply of that coffee as well?
Yeah, it becomes a little bit easier, really.
Yeah.
Because for now, some farms are very small, and you get 10 bags or something like that, and it's I can still make it last all year if I want, right? By offering it once a month or something like that. I can get, and I know this isn't answering your question quite yet, but I can get a $100 a pound coffee and afford it, and spend several $1,000s and not worry about getting rid of it all quick. With a lot of small roasters feel they can't do, because they're afraid of its aging on them, right? I can sit there all year long and offer it once a month and so on, and reduce and make it just a small amount, and sell it at the right price.
Where does technology play a role in terms of you being able to collect this information, analyze this information, and taking a step further, sharing this information? Because it's a really big part of using and making technology accessible is the ability to share important information, so that it can be useful to others who have an interest in this.
And let me answer that first question, because now I remember what it was, which was how do I deal with purchasing coffee? How does that work year round and whatever? I think it simplifies to some degree what I get to do, because I don't have to buy a particular coffee. In other words, if I really love that coffee, I can buy a whole year's worth, and I'm done with that. Right. Whereas other people are buying, I only want to get 3 months of the Guatemalan, or 4 months, and then I got to get this, and then I got to get that. And they're jumping through hoops, and the quality can vary dramatically in terms of what's offered to them. So I can really make larger commitments and sit on them, right, at something of a cost, because it's being stored in the freezer. But, it's still quite manageable, right? So that's the answer to you there. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So in regard to spreading the word and getting that out, as I was saying earlier, there are a number of roasters that I hear, well-known ones, that are doing this, and others that should be, especially with their claims to being top of the line and not being so because they don't do that, in my opinion, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, but there are more and more people, especially younger roasters, who are starting to do that as well. I think we were starting to move in the direction of Seattle. Chris Hendon, who did, I think it's Water for Coffee, that book, all about water and brewing and its relation. He was living in Boston, in the Boston area, for a few years, going to MIT, there, working there. And he gave a lecture in Seattle at the SCAA conference there. I think it was in 2017, right? And he, interestingly enough, he was not allowed to bring up my name for fear of making it a commercial statement or whatever, even though it was about the thing that I'd done, right? But I was able to bring 3 coffees in 2017 that had been harvested in 2013.
Oh.
And I had that coffee roasted, and we literally had a tasting spot right there where the conferences were taking place during the symposium. And we had a line out the door.
Yeah.
During that, I think it was for a day or two that we did it steady, right? And we would brew 3 pots of coffee. Yeah. And pour them into 3 glasses, and then people would come with a cupping spoon and another glass in their hand, spoon that into the glass and drink the cup. So one, very hygienic, and it's a system that predates COVID by a long shot, by the way. Right? And we've always done it that way.
Yeah.
And it helps it because it cools the coffee. So they taste the differences, because you taste differences far more with cool coffee than hot.
Yeah.
So the notes right there. So
what is your oldest?
Basically, yeah.
What is your oldest coffee you have?
Well, that's about it. It's around 2013, 14 right now.
Do you think there's a market for aged or like preserved, not aged necessarily, preserved coffees?
For sure. We do that. I don't have enough yet. To be blunt, the last few years have been really bad for us in terms of quality, getting quality of the highest order. We will keep what we call vintage coffee only if it's really 90 plus points, right? And that's been harder to get more recently. In Kenya, I mean, Mamuto, for instance, we have it, but Mamuto, 2 years in a row, Kenya suffered real problems.
Yeah.
The last one being rain beyond belief. Right, that really destroyed most of the crop. Practically everything that came in last year was aged,
and
in smaller quantity. Right off the bat. I mean, on arrival, it's like that. So, but it allows you to say, "Hey, it's Christmas time, or some other holiday, and remember that amazing Mamuto or other coffee that we had 3 years ago? Guess what? We're offering it for you now."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something I really want to build on, right? Going into the future. But I think it's really exciting. Aged coffee brings up an issue. It's another interesting piece, because there is one because other people will say aged coffee and they mean aged coffee.
I know that's right. Corrected.
And they say vintage and they mean aged coffee. And I do have to say that there was one aged coffee which I loved and which I can no longer get. And that was aged Sumatra. And I don't sell any Sumatra. I just find it garbage right now, to be blunt. It's very hard to control the quality. The varieties have been changed dramatically for the most part. They are not the old varieties anymore. I was buying coffee that was, as they call it, semi-washed, or what's the word? it doesn't come to me right now. Wet hulled. Wet hulled is what they call it, right? The old method there. I was able to get coffee that really was quite extraordinary, but aged very quickly, right? But the Japanese, specifically the Key company, Key, I think it was also, because they were the ones in Sumatra. I mean, Sumatra's close to them. Sumatra's like their Central America, if you will, for the States, right? They were getting an aged coffee that really was a deep golden brown color that was 5 or 6 years old.
Would that be aged in barrels, or how do they?
I don't know. When I got it, it came in smaller sacks, as I remember correctly. I hardly remember. It could have been in boxes. I, honest to God, don't remember.
So what do you think about those, like barrel aged?
It was not barrel. I remember that much, right? At least not when it arrived to us.
Yeah.
And this came through Erna Knudsen again, right? And this was primo Sumatrans with no insect damage. And so much Sumatra comes in with insect damage and all of this, which adds a bitterness to the coffee. Right. These were looking like Hawaiian Konas practically. I mean, really gorgeous, right? And aged. And the story that I got, and this is somewhat hearsay or whatever, because I couldn't get an official statement, right? There was a certain secretiveness about it, that this coffee was aged in Singapore. Right there alongside the ocean, right? And it would be allowed to moisturize and then dried and moisturized and dried over years. And you got this. And the flavor was like walking into a really great tobacco store, pipe tobacco. Sweet, round, and utterly different. Utterly different. Several years ago, I was able to get aged Sumatra. The problem was this was not the highest quality. And so while it has some of that, it also had a bitter taste. And you could see that there was insect damage to it, so on. And I've not found any source that really does that over. So you could sell aged coffee, and the Sumatra was ready-made for it. It was different than any other old coffee that I tasted. And I can't tell you why. Don't know.
I think there's one other kind of looming question here, and that's the extension of the freeze or the frozen chain into the consumers. And I know you're involved in such a product and project. Can you talk a little bit about it and say, what does it mean to the industry and to the end consumers?
Now you're talking about frozen green or frozen roasted?
Frozen roasted.
Yes, exactly. I was very frustrating for like 10 years. People were, I mean, how many videos were there from all these specialty roasters? Third wave, all of them saying you do not freeze roasted coffee. Right? Oh, condensation, all these smell in the freezer and all the rest of it. In the meanwhile, we were recommending the exact opposite, right? And if you go to the Godfrey, once we open a particular one-way valve bag, and we're retaining more of it so that people could get single cups of those, we're freezing it on the spot immediately.
Right.
It's only the first opening that you don't, because it's in the one-way valve. It's fresh.
Right.
But anything after that has been frozen, and we freeze it in our cafes in single portion. So you're opening that up. There is no condensation or anything else. You're grinding it and brewing it on the spot.
Okay, so I think that's a very important differentiation between putting a whole bag into a freezer, opening it 15 times, 20 times, and then let air in and condensate, to really packaging into single servings, taking them out and using them.
Yes.
And that's a commercial product available.
No. Well, we're doing it there for drinking, yes.
Okay.
But it's up to the consumer to take it home.
Right.
Do it. What we recommend is that they once they open the bag, they put it in Ziploc bags, which you can reuse multiple times.
Yes.
You can squeeze the air out, freeze it, and you're fine. If you're a fanatic, you do it daily. But if you're not, it's still better. And you can you're literally pouring out X number of grams and closing it, putting it back in the freezer. Your condensation is minimal.
Right. Mm-hmm,
right.
Mm-hmm.
It really is not an issue unless you're doing it over and over again.
So the general concept is basically pushing out that time of defreezing as much as you can, and to get really the freshest experience.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we learned this from the barista championships, that the colder the better. And you grind it and brew it on the spot. You don't wait for it to come to room temperature.
Okay.
At all. On the contrary. So it doesn't slow you down or anything else. And you get, the difference between a single day, right? And I did this test multiple times at home. Just one day of having opened the package of beans, right, that you grind the next day doesn't compare to what you had frozen in the beans. And you brew side by side. Big difference between the two.
So let's say, to keep it practical for people at home, if they buy a bag of coffee of really high quality specialty coffee, if they divide it, let's say, into 4 Ziploc bags and then really open one after another, that already gives them a much better quality experience than just using one bag.
Much better. And all the other types of containers do not work. They just don't. Because the coffee is degassing continuously. Freezing it stops all of that.
Okay.
And that's a really important concept for, people who are very, very into the science, homebrewers who are into the science of coffee, because, constantly, which is a truth they always hear, 2 weeks after roast, that's when coffee's at its prime.
Right.
But for someone who's really conscious about that, this can almost be a savings for them, because I know some people who after 2 or 3 weeks also drink the coffee, but because they've heard their whole, home brewing experience, coffee's not good after 2 or 3 weeks, or it's not going to be that's best, they won't drink it. And so I think for those kinds of consumers, learning the art of freezing roasted coffee can almost help them save beans, and help them go longer.
Certainly enjoy it. And become much more sensitive drinkers doing it, which is good for the farmers again, because the more sensitive they are to real differences and more nuanced differences, the more that rewards farmers who are into the craftsmanship, right? And they're seeking that.
So if you're let's say you're on a coffee subscription program and you want to do something good for the environment and not get a bag every week, but really consolidate a little bit and say, send me 2 bags every 2 weeks or 4 bags every month. For those consumers, if I get in 4 bags of coffee and put 3 of those right into the freezer, is that an option? Is that how it works?
Absolutely. I think a one-way valve, if the bag works, they don't always work, right? There's always a defective valve. You can, as long as it's a month old even, it will hold up very well. Once it's out of the bag, that's where the issue starts, right?
Okay. So either putting that bag you bought into another Ziploc bag and avoid that problem, or just repackaging it right over into Ziploc.
Yeah. That's the simplest way in my opinion.
Yeah. I always like those more practical things so people can take home and then actually replicate it.
And all of these things were not the science that got me there. It was the desire to drink the best possible stuff and sheer practicality.
Right.
That's a little bit what bugs me, is that I don't only see it in coffee, but I get to see it especially in coffee because I'm in it. Is people will make statements about quality without having tried it out themselves.
Yeah.
It's like a issue of confirmation bias.
It had to be done by people who never really tried what they were recommending against. I can't think of any other reason.
It's amazing. Well, George, this was a wonderful conversation, and I really thank you. I'm really humbled having you on this podcast.
Oh, let me just add one thing, okay? Because again, smaller roasters and such, they shouldn't just necessarily jump whole 100% into it. They should test it out. We started with small ice cream freezers, and so you get a really one that you love or whatever, package it in smaller amounts, vacuum seal it, put it in the ice cream freezer.
Yeah.
pull it out. That's how you can buy a cup of excellence and compete. Because you find 2 or 3 other people to buy with. You buy just 100 pounds or even less, 50 pounds. You can now spend $100 a pound, right?
Yeah.
And you haven't spent a fortune. You freeze it.
Yeah, and you can use it over time.
Start, right?
Yeah.
So that I needed to say.
No, absolutely. I think it's an extremely important information, because we want those farmers to thrive. We want those concepts to improve. And I know there's a lot of hesitation. Some people look at it, it's like $100 a pound. That's insane. I can never get there. But I think you're right. I think people can do it if they find the right technology. In this case, freezing, and preserve that quality, because that's ultimately what the price is paid for. And
exactly. And then if they have a small roaster, if they have a 22 kilo, we do 18 pounds sometimes.
Right.
And we'll just simply say, that's how much there is, 18 pounds. First come, first serve. Done. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, definitely. Perfect. This is fantastic, George. I really appreciate it. This is so fun. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Yeah. Sorry for going off in different directions.
No.
What the heck?
That's what coffee is all about. And I mean, with such a long time of experience you have, you're a true pioneer. You're one of those people who have been there before so many others were there. And that's why I think, we could probably talk for the next 5 hours. And actually, we have talked in the past. So I know there's more to it. There's way more to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Talking to you and Cropster, Cropster is a true pioneer. I have to say, and it's been fantastic. You've really brought a lot of complexity, but real value.
Thank you.
And I have to tell you also, when I had Coffee Connection, we didn't worry that much about roasting at all. These days, I can spend hours just trying to understand what it is that we're doing. But it really has made it much more pinpoint than ever before. So, and that's, again, valuable for the roaster, for the farmer.
Yeah, no,
getting this right.
Dialing every step of the supply chain, dialing that in and understanding it better. I think that's what we all are kind of obsessed about, and trying to improve and make it actionable to people, not just having a mathematical concept out there which nobody then knows how to implement.
Exactly.
And as you say, it's always coming from different sides, thinking, doing research, but really also the hands-on, or in this case, the mouth-on experience, tasting and getting the experience in is super important, and that's where all the passion comes for the product. So I think very, very important.
Super appreciate your role in it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, George.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Coffee and Technology Podcast, brought to you by Cropster. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe or give us a follow on any of our channels to always get the latest episode. If you're interested in more educational content on all things coffee and tech, be sure to head to cropster.com/learn or visit our YouTube channel. Cheers to more coffee.